My ex-boyfriend stood on my front porch on a Tuesday evening in November, and he looked the same way he had always looked, which was like someone who had never once considered that the world might not arrange itself around his convenience. And he said, "Natalie, I need to talk to you." And I said, "I know you do." And I stepped back and let him in. And I want to be honest that I had known this moment was coming for approximately 6 weeks, because word travels in professional circles. And I had heard through 2 separate contacts that the company Ryan had joined after leaving me for a woman named Courtney, whose family owned a pharmaceutical distribution business, was experiencing a significant leadership crisis, and that Ryan specifically was being considered for a role that required a reference from someone with credibility in the investment space, and that the most credible person in Ryan's professional network, who also happened to be in the investment space, was me. And I had decided 6 weeks earlier exactly what I was going to say when he knocked, and I had not changed my mind sitting across from him in my living room, while he explained why he needed my help, and I watched him talk, and I thought about the conversation we had had 3 years ago when he told me he was leaving, and the specific way he had said it. Hello, everyone. Welcome back. And I know I say this every time, but I genuinely mean it today specifically. I am really glad you're here for this one, because this story required me to make a decision about who I wanted to be, and I think the decision I made is more interesting than the revenge would have been. So stay with me, because the ending is not what you might expect. My name is Natalie Osei, and I am 33 years old, and I am a partner at an investment firm that specializes in healthcare sector funding, and I have been in this role for 2 years after spending 6 years building toward it, and the ex-boyfriend who knocked on my door is a man named Ryan Calloway, who left me 3 years ago for a woman named Courtney Prescott, whose family had significant money and whose connections, Ryan had decided, very practically and without much apparent guilt, were more useful to his career trajectory than I was at the time. I want to be precise about what Ryan said when he left, because the precision matters for understanding what happened when he knocked. 3 years later, and what Ryan said was, "Natalie, I think we want different things." And I said, "What things?" And he said, "I think I need to be with someone who is already where I'm trying to get to." And I said, "I'm trying to get there too." Ryan, and he said, "I know, but Courtney is already there." And I said, "So you're leaving me because her family has money?" And he said, "It's more complicated than that." And I said, "It really isn't." And he said, "I'm sorry, Natalie." And I said, "I know you are." And he left. And I sat in my apartment for a while. And then I got up and I went to work the next day and the day after that. And every day for 3 years, until I was a partner at a firm that mattered. And I had not thought about Ryan very much during those 3 years, which I want to say is the truest sentence in this paragraph. What I had thought about during those 3 years was the work, and the work had been genuinely good, and the investment firm I had joined as a senior associate 6 years. Ago had promoted me through 2 levels in 3 years, and the partnership offer had come 18 months ago, and I had accepted it. And my focus area was healthcare sector funding, which meant I evaluated and approved investment decisions for companies in pharmaceutical distribution, among other healthcare verticals. And I want you to hold that specific detail because it is going to matter in approximately 6 paragraphs. Ryan's situation when he sat in my living room was this. He had joined Courtney's family's pharmaceutical distribution company 2 years after leaving me, which was approximately 6 months after they married, in a senior operations role that suited his background, and the company had grown significantly under new leadership, including Ryan's contributions, which I want to acknowledge were real because Ryan was genuinely competent at operations, even if his personal decision-making left something to be desired. And the company was now seeking outside investment to fund an expansion into 3 new regional markets. And the investment process required the company's leadership team to submit professional references from credible figures in the investment community, and Ryan's reference list was thinner than it should have been for someone at his level because Ryan had spent most of his career inside one family business, and his external professional network had not kept pace with his seniority. and my name had come up as someone whose reference would carry significant weight with the specific firm evaluating the investment, and Ryan needed me to agree to provide it. He explained all of this clearly and without much preamble, which I had always respected about him. Ryan was not a man who circled things, and when he finished, he said, "I know this is a lot to ask," and I said, "Yes, it is," and he said, "I understand if you say no," and I said, "I know you do, Ryan." And then I said, "Tell me about the expansion," and he looked slightly surprised and said, "What?" And I said, "The 3 regional markets tell me about the business case." And he said, "Are you considering it?" And I said, "I'm listening." And he opened his phone and pulled up a summary document and walked me through it, and I asked questions the way I ask questions in any professional evaluation, and he answered them well because the business was genuinely solid and the expansion case was legitimate. And by the end of the conversation, I had a clear picture of what he was asking me to vouch for. I said, "Ryan, I need to tell you something before I decide." And he said, "Okay." And I said, "The firm that's evaluating this investment is my firm." And he went very still. And I said, "I am one of 3 partners who will vote on this specific deal." And he said, "You're on the investment committee?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "For how long?" And I said, 18 months. And he said, "And you knew that when I knocked?" And I said, "I've known for 6 weeks, Ryan." And he said, "You let me come here and explain the whole thing knowing you were going to be evaluating it anyway." And I said, "I wanted to hear it from you directly without the formal process around it." And he said, "Why?" And I said, "Because I needed to know if you would have told me if I hadn't already known." And he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I would have told you." And I said, "I think that's true." And I said, "Ryan, the reference question and the investment question are 2 separate things." And he said, "What do you mean?" And I said, "I will provide a professional reference that is accurate and honest based on what I actually know about your work, which is that you are a competent operations professional." And I said, "Separately, I will evaluate this investment on its merits, the way I evaluate every investment." And he said, "And the personal history?" And I said, "The personal history is not a variable in either of those decisions." And he said, "Natalie?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "I left you for money?" And I said, "You left me for access. And those are related but not identical." And he said, "I'm sorry." And I said, "I know, Ryan." And I said, "It's been 3 years." And I said, "I built something in those 3 years." And he said, "I can see that." And I said, "I know you can. The reference I provided was accurate and professional and said exactly what I would have said about Ryan's operational competence to anyone who asked, regardless of personal history, and the investment evaluation took 6 weeks and went through the standard process with all 3 partners reviewing the full documentation, and we approved the investment because the business case was sound and the expansion plan was credible and the financials supported the decision, and Ryan's company received the funding they were seeking, and I was one of 3 votes, and my vote was yes, based entirely on the merits of the deal. Ryan sent me a professional email after the approval that said, "Thank you for your integrity in this process." And I replied with a brief professional acknowledgement, and I did not reply further, and I sat in my office after sending it, and I thought about the Tuesday evening in November and the front porch, and the specific way he had looked standing there. And I thought about what I had said about building something in 3 years. And I thought about the fact that the investment I had just approved was going to help grow a company that Ryan was going to spend the next several years of his life running. And that company was now connected to my firm's portfolio, which meant I was going to see Ryan's professional performance reports quarterly for the foreseeable future. And I thought about the version of myself that had sat in an apartment 3 years ago after he left, and I thought she could not have imagined this specific Tuesday. And I thought that is actually the most satisfying part of this entire story. Not the approval, not the reference, not the moment he realized I was on the committee, but the simple fact that 3 years of building had produced a version of me that could sit across from Ryan Calloway and evaluate his company's future with. complete professional clarity, and no residual damage. And I think that is worth more than any revenge I could have planned. And I think Natalie from 3 years ago would agree.